Hello, my name is Sean DeWitt. I'm the Director of Restoration at the World Resources Institute. And please allow me to welcome you to the launch of our newest guidebook entitled A Step-by-Step Guide for Landscape Restoration Planners and Practitioners. And we wrote this guide because we recognize and have seen firsthand with our own eyes the complexity of planning and implementing restoration at landscape scale. And we as WRI have the pleasure of engaging with restoration planners and practitioners all over the world, from Africa to the Americas, to Asia, the US, and beyond. And we wanted to distill what we've learned into this guidebook. And these are my favorite kinds of publications. If you look at the author list, we've got representation from India, from Brazil, from Mexico, from the US, Rwanda, Kenya, and beyond, harnessing our global network of experts and everything that we've learned along the way. And for me, I see this guidebook as a super helpful checklist. And personally, I love checklists. They always remind me of the important things to not forget when I'm doing complicated things. And in this case, we have 5 sections of this checklist of this guidebook. The first is around the scope of restoration. What type of restoration are you talking about? Restoration can be a big tent, and under that tent can be everything from agroforestry to reforestation, to mangrove replanting, to riparian restoration, and beyond. And we recognize that local context matters a lot. So thinking through that scope as a first plan. The second stage then, after the scope is defined, is the design. And I love the opening sentence of the executive summary of this report. It says, restoration is not just about planting and growing trees, but considering the landscape, the people, and their priorities. And so to do that well, how to design restoration approaches within a landscape context that meet the needs of those local people and the local ecology. The third is around finance, the important question of who will pay for these different types of restoration happening within your project and your landscape. The fourth phase and the fourth stage is around implementation. Who will establish and manage the implementation of this plan? And then lastly, the fifth stage is around monitoring and maintenance. Who will maintain and how will you maintain and sustain and show the change to make sure that we have durable, permanent restoration? So this is a bit of a choose your own adventure guide, recognizing that your context is unique, but there are some common steps that we've seen as really good practices to consider along that journey. And while you can't go to Amazon and download the latest book on exactly how to do this yet, we wanted to provide this checklist as a helpful starting point. So we have an esteemed set of speakers and panelists today that are going to give us insights on exactly these topics and more. But before we get started, just 2 quick housekeeping items. First, translation is available. This webinar is available in both English and Portuguese. If you would like to listen in Portuguese, please click on the interpretation button that looks like a globe on your Zoom panel and choose Portuguese. And the second is that we want your ideas and we want your questions. We encourage your engagement throughout the session. Please use the Q&A function that you see on your Zoom panel below. And we have moderators that will do their best to answer some of those questions in real time. And we hope to have time during our panel discussion for our panelists to address some of those questions that you're asking as well. Please feel free to ask your questions both in English or Portuguese. With that, let's jump right in. First, please allow me to introduce the President and CEO of the World Resources Institute, Ani Dasgupta. Ani is an architect by training and trade, so he knows the importance of scoping and planning and designing before you move to effective implementation better than most, and who I'm pleased to say has become a restoration enthusiast as well. Ani, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. I am truly a restoration enthusiast. Thank you. First of all, I'm very excited to be part of this and on this phenomenal publication. And I want to thank all of you for joining. We have a fabulous panel after it. So I want to take a moment to share why this work is so critical. Today, as I speak to you, vast devastation is taking place in southern Brazil. Actually, our own office is closed for the last 10 days in Porto Alegre. Same thing is happening in Kenya, in Eastern Africa. India, where I see Ruchik on my screen sitting, is facing one of the most severe heat stresses. Devastating storms are going on in Central America. All this is happening, not just because, but partly because we have destroyed our ecosystem and nature over and over again, that we are dependent on for these systems to actually be predictable and work. It turns out 25% of land actually is degraded across the world. Can you imagine 25% of land that could be arable, could be used is degraded? So getting this land, this 25% restored is a critical way, but the restored in the right way that is not only just good for climate and nature, but is good for people who live there. It's income that is lost during the livelihood that is lost during, and it is also a protection from future climate-related disasters going to come. So restoration for me is actually one of those vehicles that has these three things we at WRI are critically interested in, which is how to make sure people's lives are better, how to make sure nature is revived and protected, and how to make sure climate change, both mitigation, but also adaptation. How do we do these three things together? And restoration done well and done correctly actually provides the vehicle that I think is the narrow path towards getting this right. That's why we are so excited about it. So people have recognized for a while that this is a path that needs to happen. So we have had significant, as Sean mentioned, global initiative, Bond Challenge 20 by 20 in Latin America, AFR 100 in Africa, the Harit Bharat Fund now in India, that these things are starting people recognize. So this, our job, we feel in WRI with our partners, is to learn from what is working on the ground, learn how to get with this triple outcome at the same time. What are the practices? How can we distill it, as Sean said, as checklists, make it easy to access knowledge? Because whatever we are doing is tiny compared to what needs to happen. Millions and millions of hectares of land needs to be restored across the world. Our hope is bringing this distilled knowledge, engaging with you, learning together, that we can create a movement that is required, that everyone is doing this in a way that gets us an outcome, not only restore ecosystem, but it's good for people and good for climate, good for jobs. So that is the purpose of this. This is why I'm so excited about the piece of work that you're going to learn more about. It is central, I must point out, this restoration and this approach is central to how we think about what we need to do. What we need to do in WRI is to bring the best of knowledge, best of data, best of science that is possible to do best policy and best action on the ground. That is the gap we're trying to bridge, and this is an example of how do you bridge that gap that make this learning accessible. I just also want to point out, this is one step. We're going to learn more. We're going to learn more with you. So these are your questions to our panelists is as important as the presentation itself, so that we actually create a cycle of learning and make it better as we go forward. So thank you for joining. I want to thank Sean and Ruchika to include me on this. I'm really excited we're doing this, and I'm looking forward to a fantastic discussion. Back to you, Sean.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ani. Thank you for reminding us of why we love and need restoration to achieve those goals around people, nature, and climate. And thank you for reminding us that we do want this to be very interactive. So please use the Q&A function. Let's create a dialogue here and let's learn from each other. With that, I want to turn now to Dr. Ruchika Singh. She is the Executive Program Director of Food, Land, and Water at WRI India. She's also a co-author on this publication. And Ruchika is going to walk us through the nature of this publication. What is this publication? What can you expect inside of it? And kind of walk us through this guidebook for planners and practitioners. Ruchika, over to you.
Thanks, Sean, and welcome everyone to the launch of the Restoration Launchpad. We are very excited to have you here. The Restoration Launchpad is developed by a team of researchers and implementing partners and it really provides a step-by-step process of how a restoration could be done using a landscape approach. We know there is unsustainable land management practices, increased fragmentation and degradation of forests and other ecosystems, monoculture, and these are all putting nature, climate, and livelihoods at risk around the world. As the degraded soils grow more tired, unsustainable farming and grazing practices are also, making communities struggle more in terms of how to grow food. As Sean mentioned, thinking about some of these issues and what restoration can really help with, we developed this guidebook, and the guidebook helps in walking through new and existing restoration planners and practitioners. These are basically project developers, financiers, funders, implementers through a process of how to plan a restoration project using a 5-stage framework, which is scope, design, finance, implement, and monitor. We know that following a landscape approach to restoration where conservation and development priorities are considered together can lead to multiple benefits for people, nature, and climate. And we also know, as Ani mentioned, that there is a growing recognition. There are several commitments that are already in place when it comes to the bond challenge. Several of the countries have NDC targets around that. But there's more recognition now that we need to shift the focus of restoration from commitments to implementation. This really requires significant and sustained investments at the local level. This also requires one of the barriers that we've noticed is while there is opportunity of restoration globally, locally, there is lack of clear guidelines, processes, resources, and capacity with planners and practitioners at local landscape level. And how does one address that has been one of the questions that we've been thinking through. And we know that there are several questions in this context which remain unanswered. Especially for new, restoration practitioners, it could be like building a Lego block puzzle where, you have to think about how do I design, plan, or implement a project? What are the different practices? What are the risks that I need to consider or the trade-offs, for instance? Safeguards are very critical. How do we think about social ecological safeguards? What kind of species are we thinking about? Are tenure and resource rights, for instance, considered when we are thinking about? Finance to restoration is very critical when projects are developed. Where is the funds for this going to come from? Specifically, if restoration is also going to improve livelihood opportunities, a critical question comes on, how the market access for different products can be created. Is there an opportunity? Is there a minimal viable product? Is there a specific gap that can be addressed? And of course, monitoring, which is very, very critical. What are the baseline conditions that we need to think about? And how can we monitor efforts around restoration? And these are the questions that we've been hearing different sort of restoration planners and practitioners have been asking. These are project developers, social entrepreneurs, restoration implementers, grassroots organizations, funders, and investors. And this essentially is, what led us to developing the guidebook. We started first with looking at the literature itself. We did a systematic literature review to understand whether there are gaps in resources that exist for restoration planners and practitioners, what is really available in the system. And then based on our experience from diverse geographies, especially Brazil, India, Mexico, and looking a lot, learning from what's happening in these geographies, we sort of started developing a framework of scope, design, finance, implement, and monitor. We further sort of looked at, a very consultative process to see what sort of, whether the framework needs to be refined further, what changes are needed. Essentially, because restoration can lead to multiple goal themes or benefits around climate, water, biodiversity, culture, but how to do it right becomes critical. And how can the restoration guide help you? Essentially, it is a checklist of considerations. List of questions that are widely identified by practitioners at early stage, which people who are starting projects newly will really appreciate. But from, sometimes even existing practitioners or planners or, funders, when they're thinking about developing a project, is there something that's being missing out? What could there be a particular process or question that hasn't been thought through? How do we sort of think about some of these things and solutions? Essentially, that's what it does. This is essentially a checklist, so it is flexible to adapt to different contexts. In the guide, you would find examples mostly from tree-based restoration interventions. However, because it's a guiding framework and checklist of questions, it could be adapted for different contexts as users may want to do. Now, you may ask, what kind of questions are, is basically the Launchpad answering? And to give you a bit of a flavor, these could be around, what are the clear pathways or tools that are needed by project developers to develop restoration projects? So make sure that they are socially inclusive, economically feasible, ecologically sustainable. When donors and investors are, funds are catalytic, what needs can they serve in the restoration ecosystem? What are the key aspects to be considered when thinking about that? Or what are the considerations around building and bridging capacity gaps, sharing knowledge, expertise, and resources that are needed to make for an inclusive and effective way of restoring landscapes. So coming to the framework directly, as I said, it is a 5-stage framework. We focused on scope, design, finance, implement, monitor. It helps really for each of these stages to consider different sort of opportunities. For instance, when we are thinking about scoping a restoration opportunity, what are the goals? What are the trade-offs? What is the regulatory context within which a project can be developed? Is restoration feasible in a particular project? When one is designing a restoration initiative, once we've identified there is an opportunity, then what sort of interventions would be critical when we are thinking about it? How will that help, practitioners and, to plan for it? Financing and allocating resources is very, very critical because that's what really helps in, designing a good design project needs funds and resources to actually implement them on the ground. What would be the most efficient way to budget? What are the resource allocations that are needed? Are all aspects considered when planning a project? What is being missed out? What are the different funding options that are available? Have those been considered? And how do we sort of, build some of that? On implement, the implement phase focuses specifically on a checklist of questions which are related more to what's happening on the ground in terms of working with different landowners, communities, how a site could be prepared, how sort of, different resources, planting material, what are the risks that need to be mitigated when we are thinking about restoration, if there are disturbances on the site, invasive species or others, how do we consider some of those aspects? And monitoring, very, very critical. We can only know how we are doing if we can track progress of what we have done. So, monitoring the project's performance over time also helps us, and being adaptive about it, also helps us understand whether there needs to be a change in the design if something else needs to happen. So the framework itself, and all of these stages, really in the scope, for instance, goes into details, and there is a lot of resources, supplementary material that's available in terms of why restore, into what goals and outcomes, for instance, trade-offs, etc. On the screen here, you see some examples of that. Similarly, I mean, but the most important issue is if you're thinking about this scoping a restoration project, why should you pursue it? I think the goal needs to be clear. Similarly, when one thinks about designing a restoration project, what are the key steps when one is thinking about designing a restoration project? How does one, what type of interventions, whether it's agroforestry, whether it's riparian restoration or something else? How do you sort of think about what interventions would be applicable and what activities need to be done and what sort of, partnerships need to be done at the design stage? Thinking about who are the other partners, for instance, would also be critical. The finance piece is very critical in terms of thinking about, as I said earlier, how do we finance and move a project from design to implementation, revenue sources, costs and financing of it, different options that are available. And the implement is about site preparation, how do we manage planting and growing, different sort of resources that are needed when we want to do that. And monitor is critical because it really helps us sort of think through in terms of how could we maintain or improve a project. Do we need to think about adaptive management considerations while doing that? What are the indicators and metrics to consider when we are thinking of, and are these sort of sufficient and relate to the restoration objectives that were put in place to design it? And most importantly, what is the impact on ecosystem and people? Having a metrics around some of those issues also becomes very critical. Learning from across the world globally and from, implementation experience, and all of you would agree, depends on key principles, which are about, what's happening in terms of the social issues, tenure, resource rights, ecology, and financial aspects, which are key to consider if one wants to sort of make a sustainable restoration project. This is an example in terms of the kind of resources and considerations that are available I've taken this example from the design stage. So after already scoping has been done, the questions could help you sort of identify the type of interventions, how these interventions could help you support the goals. Also what sort of interventions work across landscapes. Landscapes are critical. Any project which is planned not thinking about the entire landscape and its priorities may not work, and it has to consider people's priorities. Managing key activities, just as an example, what are the sort of key support resources needed to support each activity? Has a monitoring system been developed? And these are the just, different kind of resources that are available. The checklist and the suite of resource material, apart from, these questions, we also have consolidated, additional supplemental reading material based on what's considered the best available science, but also on social ecological considerations together in this guidebook. But I have to emphasize, this is still just a guide. It's a checklist with the questions that can be adjusted to local landscape conditions. So please own it, adapt it. We love feedback to see how some of this on ground can be further sort of developed further. And with that, I'd like to pass it back to Sean. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruchika, for walking us through the main sections of the document. That's really, really helpful. Thank you. Now let's move to our esteemed panel. You see them here on your screen. I'm really excited that we have 3 practitioners of restoration representing 3 major regions of the world, from Rwanda, Brazil, and India. And we also have a funder of restoration with Johannes, and we also have an impact expert. So we have a nice diversity of skills and experiences on this panel as well. So I'm really excited for us to jump right in. What I'll do is I'll introduce each one of them individually, ask them a question. And please, again, audience, please be thinking of your questions for our panelists as well. And please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. So first, I'd like to introduce Madeline Udahogora. Madeline is a project manager at the Rwanda Rural Rehabilitation Initiative, where she was noted as a top performer in 2022 as their best innovator. So we've got the right person here in Madeline. She's a PhD student at Xinjiang Institute of Ecology and Geography, where I believe she's calling in from today in China. And she has over 100 professional citations of her written works highlighting restoration and landscape awareness in Rwanda. Amazing. Madeline, a question for you. Just how was your experience building a world-class restoration effort in Rwanda in the absence of really having any clear guidelines? Like, you're truly a pioneer and really trying to invent the way this should work. Could you highlight for us just what some of the key challenges that you might have faced while working toward landscape restoration? And do you think a guidebook like this can help other restoration practitioners? That over to you, Madeline.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam. During my landscape restoration effort, we passed through a lot. So, but we have gone through a lot by how we come to realize that observation of landscape, the feasibility study, and the restoration plan guided the whole restoration process. And for planning and implementation, we realized that the village land use action plans have an important role. For finance, the resource mobilization, including the community contribution, is also a key. So during my journey of restoration, we also have passed through many challenges because we didn't have any guidelines to follow. We were just like, how can I say, we were in the absence of a clear guidelines to build a strong restoration project. Many of us tried to leverage our expertise of our peers when designing our projects. However, such efforts are not systematic, and the result tend to be the restoration effort that emphasized only on a few components, depending on the expertise of the same people, the same group that's implementing the project. For example, like after reading this book, I realized that in our project design, some activities were not properly managed. Like, for example, the gender inclusion, we didn't focus on it for sure. I realized that after reading the book. So it is so beneficial and it is educative. So what we see then is, before the guidelines, before the guidebook, is that in the end, project could be playing a catch-up to include component that has not been done at the beginning or enhance some weeks. Like, for example, we realized at the end of project that we didn't choose the proper source of finance, that we didn't choose the appropriate one. And we realized it at the end of project. When we were designing our project, we didn't see that, but we only see that at the end of the project. Or in some cases also, the project could be unfinished because the developers were not fully aware or to what to be involved. We were not aware of what is really needed, what should we involve in our project. So like we have so many examples of project that fails because the developers didn't know. They was just imagining something that without considering the landscape, without considering some factors, they were just like practicing something that was done in Central Asia, doing the same thing in Africa. And it is not the same because the landscape itself is not the same. So in such cases, some projects were failing because we were just like copying something from another landscape, from another, we didn't consider the climate issues, the landscape, we were just practicing what we get from the online, from some books, etc. So a guidebook like this will help practitioners to think about all the components to involve in our project design when it comes to restoration, and also will help us to allocate the right amount of time and the financial resources to each of those components. Like in my institution, most of the challenges we faced arose primarily because each donor has their own specific vision and approaches for how the restoration projects should be implemented. They don't consider like our landscape, they don't consider our challenges, they don't consider our societies, they just come like that and say that you need to do like this. What have been done in Asia, what have been done in South America might be done in Rwanda, but that is not possible because the landscape is different, the society is different. So I think this guidebook is the best option to ensure that the landscape restoration, as it will help so many donors in harmonizing the work accordingly. I think this is a very good contribution to the landscape restoration project. So after reading this book also, I realized that the goals and priorities for restoration are well defined and designed, and this will make the implementation of the restoration project more successful, maybe in Africa and somewhere else. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sam.
Emmeline, thank you so much. I mean, I think it speaks to the complexity of these kind of landscape restoration projects when an award-winning, like renowned institution like yours, Madeline, and thank you for being so candid about some of the things that you realize that were overlooked in the first stage of implementation. The restoration calls on us to try to integrate. It sometimes feels like 50 different disciplines and answer to 5, different bosses in everything that we're trying to do. And it is often a balance and an emphasis that you have to place. And so it is why we felt a checklist like this would be super important, because for us too, it's often not until you're applying for a grant or applying for a loan or doing something where you're asked a lot of these questions. Explain to me your gender strategy. And we thought, well, much better for us to have some kind of checklist that's not in that pressurized moment to try to acknowledge these things. But thank you so much, Madeline, for sharing your experience. And the work that you do in Rwanda is absolutely incredible. I encourage everyone to check out more information about the Rwanda Rural Rehabilitation Initiative. Thank you, Madeline. Next, I'd love to turn to Paula. Paula Pontelli Fernandez Costa is a co-author of the publication. She is also the CTO and operations director of Preta Terra, an amazing organization. It's the biggest agroforestry intelligence hub in Brazil. I think the biggest agroforestry intelligence hub in the world. Her dynamic work over the years as a forest engineer, a biologist, and a specialist in environmental management awarded her in 2016. Was awarded in 2016 by the Brazilian Society of Forest and Silviculture. Paula brings a lot of these different skill sets together, and it's a really interesting firm because it's focused on this design phase and partnering with folks to make sure that the design is done really, really well. Paula, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm curious, like based on the technical support that you give through Preta Terra, and that you've been providing around the world to increase the scale and the quality, especially of agroforestry systems. And as a project implementer, are there sections of the document that you feel are most important for practitioners to pay attention to, and why? And of course, we'd love to hear a little bit more of your story. Paula, over to you.
Hello, Sean. Thank you so much, everyone, for the invitation, for being here, and for being able to contribute a bit with this super important document. And well, actually, of course, I should say that the whole document is super important for practitioners, but for people on the ground, for the ones that are really going to implement, to plant it, for the implementers themselves, I would say that the sections 2 and 4 are crucial, are the most important. First of all, the stage 2, which is the design, as you mentioned, is the one that we in Preta Terra focus more, because we understand what are the intentions or the demands of donors, of financiers, and how we can develop it and deliver it realistically on the ground. So we need to understand, to have these diagnostics on the ground and really see what is the landscape level challenges, what is it possible to be done with the resources we have available. And this is really a puzzle. This is not a simple task to be done. And sometimes we have this whole sets of ideas, and it's really important to be creative, to find solutions for all these challenges we have on the ground. But at the same time, we need to be realistic, and we need to understand what are the resources available, how is the land, what is the state of the land, where can we reach with this restoration initiative. And most importantly, also, I think we need to be conservative, because most of the time it is much more challenging where we are implementing than we are planning. When we plan, say, okay, I think we're going to be able to do it, but when we are on the ground, we face so much more challenges than we mapped before. So always important to be mapping risks and challenges that we think we will face, and set a plan on how we will address them. But this point that Madeline mentioned about the expectations, right? How we can set expectations from farmers, from donors. This is super challenging in this design phase. And I think this is a stage that is super crucial, because, for instance, in many projects that we have, donors are focusing, for instance, in carbon sequestration, right? We want a plantation that fixes a lot of carbon. On the other hand, the farmers or landowners, they are interested in production. And that's why we also choose to plant agroforestry systems. So we need to balance those expectations in the same project. And in this design phase is when we need to be transparent and tell everybody what is it possible to be done with the resources we have available. And I guess this is super crucial. And of course, the stage 4, where is the implementation phase itself, that's when the challenge is really going to happen, because it's always much more challenging than we thought. And I mean, the information we have available in the document are super precious, because you can adapt it to different realities. You can address it to different realities. But in the end, we need really to dive deep in this planning. And what we really are going to do in the implementation is to get all the resources we have available, especially the finance resources, and manage it in a proper way to make sure that we have results with this investment, because it is an investment, and it's a super we really have a responsibility with these. We have this resource available. We need to have results, and that's why we need to be very conservative in this case, and always know that we have challenges, different challenges, and these challenges are also scaling. So, for instance, what we see like 5 years from now, like back from now, I mean, 5 to 10 years back from now, we didn't really need, if we planned and planted the restoration in the proper timing, we didn't really need irrigation. We didn't really need emergency irrigation because we could then rely in the rain. But now, in these last 2 to 3 years, even this year now, we are not relying on rain anymore. It's hard to rely on rain now. And now, so this is a new cost that is adding up to the planification and to to the risk mapping as well. So those are some things that really need to map before and to be ready in the implementation. So I would say that for the people on the ground, these are the two sections, the two stages that are super crucial and need to be digged very deep for these people really to be able to implement on the ground.
Paula, thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing your
pleasure.
experience and your wisdom in this. And it strikes me that, you know, and we, to be honest, we had a hard time structuring this publication in a way that could honor the diversity of what's real on the ground, but also still be understandable, right? But I think what you're highlighting is that if you looked at this publication, you would think this is a nice linear approach, right? First you scope, then you plan, then you implement, then you monitor. When the reality is, like, this is a very adaptive process, right? And it's a very iterative process. So probably these stages are sitting in a circle, right? And you've got a plan. It's super important to plan. Once you start implementing, you realize that some aspects of the plan, you're partnering with Mother Nature too. You're getting feedback from Mother Nature. Things are adjusting and adapting. And like one of my favorite quotes is from a boxer. His name is Mike Tyson. And he says, you know, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. I thought it's just a great quote for life, because it's true that with our work, right, there's sometimes policies that come in, or commodity price changes, or there's weather, climatic events are happening more and more, right? So there's just more and more of these kind of things that happen, and you have to go back and adjust that plan. So thank you for reminding us of this iterative nature of the plan and for shining a spotlight on the second and the fourth stages. Thank you, Paula. Next, I would love to introduce our third practitioner, Kritika Ravishankar. Kritika is a co-founder of Farmers for Forests in India, a very, very interesting group. Her work focuses on protecting and increasing India's biodiverse tree and forest cover in union with communities that are the most vulnerable to climate change, so really on the front lines of climate change. She has over 11 years of experience in international development and equity, and business research sectors. So Kritika, thank you so much. We're thrilled to have you with us here. I'd love to ask you a similar question to the question that I asked Madeline, you know, and just curious for your experience, again, as a pioneer that's been kind of writing the rules of how this should work, and building this world-class restoration effort that you have in India. In the absence of having a playbook, what were some of the key challenges that you faced and have overcome around landscape restoration? And you know, how could a guidebook like this be useful for other practitioners? So over to you, Kritika. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you for having me. So when we started 4.5 years ago, there wasn't a guidebook like this. And, you know, we faced so many challenges. And now when I was going through the guidebook, I was like, I wish we'd had something like this when we first started out. But I think when we first started out, we started off with an idea of like payments for ecosystem services, which is, on the one hand, you have farmers with land that they aren't using. And then on the other hand, you have the possibility of people willing to pay for ecosystem services, whether that's carbon or other things. And, you know, that model in our head sounded really good. So when we started off, and we of course had to experiment with a lot of things. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we faced, and I'll tell you how that played out for us also, was that, and the guidebook calls this out as well, that it's really important to take a landscape approach. So when we started off, we were of course very enamored with, you know, like dense, beautiful, biodiverse forests, like everybody here in restoration. So we essentially like incentivized farmers to grow dense, biodiverse forests on private agricultural land. And in some cases that didn't really work out very well, because maybe that wasn't the best type of intervention to undertake for private land, because even though the farmers were getting the payments for ecosystem services, There was more biodiversity, the soil health was improving, etc. The people in the village really hated these forests. They thought they were too dense and too wild for agricultural land. They would have preferred something like agroforestry. Like agroforestry would have been a much better intervention for private land. So, even though the farmers were getting the ecosystem payments, they were happy. It was, everything was dense, biodiverse, beautiful. There were birds, bees, etc., being attracted. Because the community in the village and others around, other farmers around, disliked this so much. In some cases, the farmer actually was pressurized by the village to cut these down. So I remember even in a very early conversation I'd had with Dr. Ruchika, there was always this emphasis on look at what works at a landscape level. So in India specifically, in any given context, you have typically three or four different types of land. So one is privately owned farmer land, one is land which is managed by the community, one is land which is managed by the forest department, and then sometimes, depending on where you are, you have land which is managed by a municipal corporation or a semi-urban body. And for each of these land types, there are actually different interventions that the guidebook calls out on. So, everything from assisted natural regeneration to agroforestry. And the idea that for each type of land, there could be different interventions. And the idea that for each type of land and each type of intervention, there could be a different source of financing that is used as well, because carbon might not work really well for carbon payments, or carbon credits might actually not work really well for commonly managed land. So, things like that, which the guidebook also references, I think are things that we've learned over time, but I wish we'd had a chance to know that a few years earlier.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kritika. It is true, like with the different land tenure and resource tenure regimes and rights, like you do see quite a different set of opportunities that are available within that landscape. And again, trying to design with that kind of diversity is not trivial, right? And it's one of those things we really should continue to pull together best practices on this. Again, what we have here is a bit of a checklist to remind you to think of these things. I think for every step in those checklists, we could go a lot deeper with organizations like yours, Kritika, to learn from your experience. So thank you so much for sharing your experience there. Now I would love to turn to Dr. Kathleen Buckingham, a co-author of the publication. She has more than 15 years of restoration fieldwork experience across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. She currently serves as Director of Impact at Veritree, an organization that pushes the elevation of global restoration and unlocking investment in nature. And I had the pleasure of working with Kathleen for 8 years. She's a WRI alumni, so it's great to be reconnected with you here, Kathleen. Curious, as you work with planting partners on projects that involve monitoring procedures, and you're thinking about impact, both how to realize impact, but then also how to measure that impact. How could this guidebook be useful for planning restoration projects? And if you can also talk about like how the checklist provided in the guidebook could be adapted to suit like the different types of projects. I know you support quite a diversity of projects, Kathleen. How those could be adapted to suit the different kinds of projects that you support at Veritree.
Of course, thank you, Sean. It's good to see you again. So I think it comes down to that checklist that everyone's been talking about and how useful it is. And I think it can help in two ways with what we do at Veritree. It can support our due diligence process for corporate partners. And also it helps with the documentation and the formalization of processes with standard operating procedures with partners. As Madeline was saying, observation guides the process, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's down on paper. So this really helps to put that down on paper, which both of these kind of look at different audiences, but both are key to continued investment in nature-based solutions. And I guess before I go into more details, I think it's important just to briefly say what I do. Veritree is a technology company that unlocks finance for restoration through providing corporate partners with evidence of planting, survivability and impact. So for example, a credit card company maybe wants to plant a tree for every transaction. And Veritree works together with planting partners to monitor the tree growth and survivability and measure impact. So with that, there's a need for corporations investing in nature-based solutions to have confidence in that, confidence of the due diligence. So to make sure that, for example, in the scope phase, that there's been adequate attention to detail of understanding the feasibility, understanding the sustainability of approaches. And it's important to note that Veritree doesn't plant trees. We work closely with partners to co-design our systems. And while we focus on monitoring, we need to ensure that we're looking at the projects and our partners holistically. So making sure that it adheres to good practices from the checklist that's in the guide, from engagement to land rights to understanding drivers of degradation, and the guide really helps with that. And apart from the corporate side, bringing it back to your question about the planting partners, Sean, it's important to align on standard operating procedures with planting partners. And I think the guide provides that framework to create expectations, shared expectations, and shared efficiencies. So we know what is going to happen at what stage throughout the process. And like everyone's been saying, it's an iterative process. So maybe it's not, first you start with scope design, implement, monitor. It's more, monitoring will go on at different stages, but it's important to have that as a reference so that we can look at that. And we're able to check what's included in that scope design, implement, and monitor. And I think you made an important point, Sean, earlier, saying that restoration is like a large tent. And that's what we're trying to look at. We're trying to create a Veritree protocol for each different restoration type that we're engaged in. So mangroves, agroforestry, we're involved in deforestation with kelp, and then also terrestrial forestry for recovering from wildfire. And I think this guide provides like a high level overview, as others have been saying. It doesn't necessarily get into the details, but it can be adapted. So for example, from the design section, when we're looking at mangroves, we're thinking about hydrology and hydrodynamics, but that issue of the challenges that you have to face in the design stage have been asked at the scope stage. So what are the drivers of degradation? What challenges do you have to think about so you can adapt it to make it more specific to the landscape or the type of intervention that you're thinking about? And thinking about the monitoring section as well, and that's something that we're very key into thinking about. It doesn't go into the technology. It doesn't say these are the sensors or the geospatial technology you need, but it looks at that framework for baseline performance, adaptive management, and exit strategies. So you're really thinking of it as an iterative process, a holistic way of thinking about it, and to guide you to think, well, what if you do face challenges, which you will, and what do you do when you've planted all the trees? What are the livelihood strategies? So I think overall, it's been really helpful to think about how we solidify our due diligence process and documentation process with our planting partners. Thanks.
Terrific, Kathleen. Wow, that's quite a variety of different practices to monitor, and it's a good reminder of just the importance of linking the monitoring and the design phase to make sure that you can actually track all those different types of practices you have under that tent that you have at Veritree. Definitely encourage everyone to check out the really innovative work that Veritree is doing with Kathleen's leadership. Thank you so much, Kathleen. Last and never least, we have Johannes van de Ven. Johannes currently serves as the chair of the WI Brazil board. He's been the managing director of Good Energies Foundation since 2014. Through his impactful work, he focuses on climate mitigation, investing in clean and renewable energies, natural ecosystem restoration and reforestation. He's one of the great champions of restoration around the world. If you don't follow Johannes on LinkedIn, you should. He's one of the most valuable people to follow. He shares a tremendous amount of really valuable material. So I highly recommend following Johannes there. Johannes, from a donor's perspective, I'm curious, and based on your experience in supporting restoration initiatives around the world, I'm curious from your perspective, what is the value of a guidebook like this? And is there a section of the guidebook that you feel is most critical for success in restoration, and why? Thanks for being with us here, Johannes, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sean, for this overgenerous introduction. And it's a privilege to be here on such a distinguished panel and contribute to this conversation. And well, from a donor perspective, and also based on my experience here at Good Energies, I think there is a lot of value and many reasons why supporting restoration makes total sense and gives you a tremendous return. I think the guidebook itself, the conclusion of the guidebook says it all, right? Restoring landscapes and forests, and I'm quoting here, is one of the most effective ways, right? I would also say most cost-effective ways to recover degraded areas, combating climate change, and above all, empowering vulnerable communities. And that's something that I think the guidebook makes very clear. The needs for restoration can be very different. It's never, let's say, a one size fits all, or the trees are the solution to it, right? It's there are many reasons for why restoring makes sense. And for example, in India, I was reading, it's often linked to water security. In Mexico, it could be about prevent flooding along the coastline, or in Brazil, as I've learned, it's often about food security or creating vital jobs in the landscapes. Or even bigger, at the global level, restoration can be seen as an insurance or best guarantee to prevent another big zoonotic disease. So it makes total sense. But I think that message is not really fully understood, or this narrative is not really effectively communicated, right? And that's where philanthropy can play a bigger role. And I think philanthropy should play a bigger role in transmitting this message more forcefully, not only to the policymakers and the practitioners, but also to a wider public. And I think is more recognition of these multiple benefits could unlock more attention, and then this could lead to more sustained funding in this space. Because I think restoration is not something nice to have, but I would say it's something that we really must do. And that's a message we have to make more forcefully. And as a second point made in the guidebook, where donors should step up, is that planners and practitioners, they need clear and feasible pathways, right? And I think, Hushika, you already said it at the very beginning. We need pathways that are ecologically sustainable, socially inclusive, and economically viable, right? And those are very important distinctions, but I think we have to bypass those generalizations like trees are great or trees are the answer. I think we need very concrete data and provide evidence which tree in which landscapes makes total sense, right? It depends very much on the context. And even, as we already heard several times today, under different climate conditions, a tree type makes sense today, but cannot make sense down the road, right? As Paula already said several times. I think we have to anticipate these changes, and therefore this launchpad makes a good sense. So to pay attention to the right model of restoration makes very important sense. It's not about simply tree planting, but we have to learn how to do this, right? And I think donors could add substantial value to this. But let me move now to the second part of your question, Sean. You asked me which part of this guidebook is more critical for success, right? And I would say all 5 components are equally important. The scoping, designing, financing, implementing, and monitoring, they're all equally important. And I would say these 5 components are like a value chain. And as you know, the weakest link breaks the chain. So I would say, what is the weakest link? So we should pay attention to all 5 equally. But I think, Sean, that answer might not be very satisfactory if I say all 5. So let me highlight 2 pieces, but I think are really undervalued or not really fully understood, or let's say underappreciated, that require more attention. And also, Paula, you already voted for number 2 and 4, right? So let me vote then on number 3 and 5, right? So that's the financing and the monitoring. I think they stand out from a donor perspective. So the first one is on access to finance, right? And here with my philanthropic hat on, I think philanthropies, they have patient capital. They should really be catalytic, not just incremental, right? And they should really help to de-risk private funding and unlock more public funding. And in that sense, I think philanthropies, they should make a bigger use of the capital toolbox, not just hug a tree or plant a tree, but they should really try to be more innovative with first loss tranches, guarantees, convertibles, concessional loans, and so on. The capital toolbox is very big in that sense. And I think even philanthropy could be seen as collateral for more investment in this space. And for example, venture philanthropy could also set up as a guarantee fund for restoration enterprises. And Preta Terra is a good example. We have Belterra, we have Regreen, we have Fair Ventures Indonesia. There are so many of them that deserve more capital. And a good example is right now the excitement around cocoa, right, in West Africa and in Latin America, getting a lot of attention. Or from, I would say, even from a bigger, more global perspective, I think we need to help to mainstream restoration, right? Nature has to be put on the balance sheet. And it's not something, I think, the discussion is too much of a, this is nice to do as a corporate giving strategy for an organization, but it should be seen, as you, Sean, I think you said it brilliantly on your TED Talk, restoration is an investment in our planetary foundations. I think that should be driven home by hedge funds, asset managers, insurance companies, you name it, right? So that's number one, access to finance. And then I think a second area of what's critical for success, and then I think requires more attention, is I think the last point you're making, monitoring. And this is where I think philanthropies could play a role. I think monitoring both in the sense of validating best practices, but also learning from failures, right? As Kritika already said, failures are critically important. And we should not only talk about our success stories, how good we are, but we should talk more about what does not work, right? I think the lessons learned from failures, they can be even more instructive, right? And we need to have a better understanding of what's really working and what's not working. And therefore, we need the right metrics, as I think Kathleen already said well, right? I think most monitoring efforts I can see, they focus too much on the tree planting, but less attention is being paid to the co-benefits, right? As mentioned in the launch pad, on biodiversity recovery, jobs being created, communities being strengthened, etc. It's all much better. And I think, and this is my last point, Sean, I think if we have a better understanding of the multiple co-benefits for people and communities, this would unleash more appreciation and more, I would say, even would encourage students to embrace a career in, let's say, sustainable development strategies within planetary boundaries, right? I think, for example, in Brazil, we have enough students that go on to study agribusiness, right? Agronomy, but we hardly have a school in tropical ecology, right? And if I read the guidebook well, I think we don't need more agronomy for export-led commodities like big bulk in soy, palm, ethanol, but we should rather have courses in integral ecology that focus on local landscapes and territorial development. I think that's very key, and you're contributing to this with the guidebook. Back to you, Sean.
Fantastic, Johannes. Thank you so much for shining a light on all five, but also on finance and monitoring, which are inextricably linked. Yeah, so thank you so much, Johannes. We are at time. What I would love to do is, if for folks that are able to stay, if we could take 5 minutes, and we'll close promptly in 5 minutes. But there is one theme in the questions. We're not going to get to all the questions, but there is a theme in the questions that does tend to focus a bit around finance, and also a bit around some questions around carbon as well. So I'm kind of curious if I could just ask for maybe just 2-minute response from both Paula and Kritika on this. That we have some questions around how do you, like for Paula, it's like, how do you see the general distribution of investors in Brazil on restoration? And then Kritika, I'd love to come to you because I know that you're in the midst of developing a carbon project. Just any reflections that you have on that capital stack, and maybe a bit of what Johannes mentioned in terms of philanthropy's role in being catalytic. But first, Paula, over to you. The distribution of what you're seeing for investment in restoration in Brazil.
Well, I think that today we have a lot of opportunities for the Amazon, right? So most of the investment, most of the funds are going to the Amazon. And this is super important. We always say that the Amazon is our most the region that we really must protect the most, but it is the most preserved yet. Thank God, it's still preserved. It's not the most degraded. And yet we have other landscape, other ecosystems like Atlantic rainforest, for instance, where is most of the population of Brazil, that doesn't have that much attention and that much funding. And of course, that's one of the reasons we are seeing these challenges we are facing in the South today. It's because of the huge degradation we have in the Atlantic rainforest. And we are super behind in restoration, in restoring the Atlantic rainforest. So I think this is one point that we are missing out. You know, I think we should focus in the Amazon. Of course, we should restore, but we should focus on the conservation, specifically on preservation or keeping it intact. But restoration, we must find the ecosystems that are super degraded, like Atlantic rainforest. And also the tendency we have now is for carbon. So carbon is really what is making it viable for us to fund the restoration projects. However, we are not still, it's not really clear how much the planting itself, it's going to, how much carbon is going to create, how much carbon credits it's going to generate after the years.
Great.
And we are trying to think of projects that really are able to fix more carbon in a shorter term. So I think this is a huge challenge now, how we make sure that restoration really addresses the carbon agenda as well.
Definitely a topic we could have a whole separate session on. But Krutika, maybe last word to you. Just curious for your experience in this financial stack that includes carbon.
Sure. So I think I really agree with what Johannes said earlier, that what we're seeing is that the prices in the market are, like you have to do a lot of things in a carbon project, like collect data, ensure co-benefits, ensure gender and financial inclusion, etc. And I think philanthropy can really play a catalytic role in two ways. So one is when you have philanthropic capital coming in, you can really design a project to focus on biodiversity, to focus on community benefits, to focus on inclusion, and not necessarily just have to optimize for carbon. And second, what we're seeing is that, if there is buyers or investors are, the sooner they're investing in the project, the more of a risk premium they're demanding. So if philanthropy is able to come in, de-risk the project for the first 3-4 years, by that time, all your trees and other things are in the ground, contracts are in place, you're starting to see growth, co-benefits, all of those things. At that point, getting in a financier is easier because you're able to sell those credits for much higher, which means more money goes back to the community as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Krutika. Such a great and rich experience. Again, I think we should have a separate session on this very important topic. First, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And thank you so much for each of you being a pioneer in this space. We haven't had a chance to get to all the questions, but we have a record of all the questions. And as we follow up with you with links to the guidebook and this, we will also make sure that we follow up on each of your questions. So thank you everyone for sharing your questions. This hour went very quickly. This guidebook is a snapshot of what we've learned to this point. It is imperfect. We hope it's a good contribution. We welcome your feedback, your insights, what's working, what isn't, how are you using the guidebook, where was it helpful, where did it fall short? We would love to hear from you. So let's keep this dialogue going. Indeed, restoration is nothing short of, it needs to be a movement in order to fully achieve the ambitious goals that we have. It needs each one of us. And indeed, we are on this journey together. With that, I will call this webinar to a close and thank you so much for your participation.